Have you ever looked at what you chose to wear on a normal day and realized it had less to do with fashion, weather, or trends, and more to do with how much attention or distance you felt like dealing with? And have you noticed that on some days lighter clothes feel easier to wear, while on other days the same colors feel strangely uncomfortable, as if being seen takes more energy than you have? Today, we're looking at the psychology of people who wear light clothing, not as a statement, but as a quiet reflection of what the mind is carrying at that moment. Before clothing becomes preference, before color becomes taste, and long before identity is attached to aesthetic choice, the human mind is already responding to a far more primitive signal, which is whether a presence absorbs attention or reflects it back into the world. Light and dark operate at this level, not as symbols learned through culture, but as perceptual conditions that quietly inform the nervous system about exposure, distance, and the degree to which something is allowed to be seen without resistance. In this sense, clothing does not function as decoration, but as a boundary, a moving psychological membrane that mediates the relationship between the inner world and the external gaze, constantly adjusting how much contact is permitted between the self and its surroundings. Dark clothing absorbs visual information, softening edges, reducing contrast, and creating a perceptual quiet that allows the wearer to move through space with less friction, less interruption, and fewer demands placed upon their presence. Which is why darkness has long been associated with protection, even when no conscious intention exists. Psychologically, this absorption serves regulation, because when the body becomes less visually distinct, the mind experiences a corresponding reduction in stimulation, allowing attention to turn inward rather than remain dispersed across the environment, which can be especially stabilizing for individuals who have learned that visibility invites pressure rather than safety. Over time, darkness can become less of a choice and more of a strategy, a reliable method for maintaining control over how much of oneself is registered by others, and for limiting the unpredictable interpretations that accompany being clearly seen. Light clothing operates in the opposite direction, not by demanding attention, but by refusing to absorb it, reflecting presence outward and making edges, movement, and form more legible to the surrounding world, which immediately changes the psychological contract between the wearer and their environment. To be visible in this way is not to perform, but to accept that perception will occur without negotiation, without the buffer that darkness naturally provides, and without the illusion that interpretation can be fully managed or anticipated. The mind understands this intuitively, which is why light often feels more exposing than dark, even when no actual risk is present, because exposure is not defined by danger alone, but by the loss of control over how one is read. Being seen means being interpreted, and being interpreted means allowing meaning to be assigned from the outside, which carries emotional weight regardless of whether that meaning is accurate, fair, or even noticed consciously. For someone accustomed to darkness, light can feel destabilizing, as if it removes a layer of insulation that once kept the world at a tolerable distance. Not because the person is fragile, but because distance has long been their primary means of regulation. When a person begins to gravitate toward light clothing, the shift is rarely sudden and almost never superficial, because it usually follows a prolonged period of internal containment, during which the effort required to manage visibility has quietly accumulated into fatigue. This fatigue does not announce itself as weakness, nor does it present as dissatisfaction with identity, but rather as a growing resistance to the constant compression of the self. The ongoing work of holding posture, presence, and perception within tightly controlled boundaries. Darkness excels at containment, but containment carries a cost, because what is consistently held inward eventually becomes heavy, not due to its content, but due to the effort required to keep it from expanding. Light clothing, in this context, does not represent confidence in the performative sense, nor does it signal optimism, innocence, or a desire to be perceived positively, but instead reflects a quieter recalibration in which the individual decides, often unconsciously, that the cost of concealment now outweighs the risks of exposure. Light allows the body to occupy space without constant negotiation, reducing the need for strategic self-presentation and easing the mental load associated with monitoring how much of oneself is visible at any given moment. Psychologically, this shift aligns with a loosening of control, not as surrender, but as conservation, because relinquishing constant management frees energy that was previously locked into defense. It is important to distinguish visibility from attention, because attention is something actively sought or avoided, while visibility is passive, existing regardless of intent. And many people who wear light clothing are not seeking attention at all, but are simply no longer investing energy into preventing it. This distinction matters because seeking attention implies motivation and desire, whereas accepting visibility implies tolerance. A willingness to allow perception to occur without shaping its outcome. Light clothing often coincides with a state of mental spaciousness, not happiness or clarity in any idealized sense, but a reduction in internal congestion, where thoughts, emotions, and self-monitoring no longer crowd the same limited psychological space. This spaciousness does not emerge from strength alone, but from repeated cycles of control and recalibration, during which the individual learns that perfect concealment does not guarantee safety, and that excessive management of perception often amplifies anxiety rather than reducing it. As this realization settles, darkness may lose some of its psychological necessity, not because it is rejected, but because it no longer provides sufficient relief from the internal weight it was meant to manage. Light clothing also subtly alters social positioning, because in many environments it aligns with openness, neutrality, and shared space, allowing the wearer to participate without signaling withdrawal or resistance, even when no active engagement is intended. This participation does not require extroversion, emotional transparency, or social confidence, but reflects a willingness to exist within the shared field rather than at its edges. There is a quiet relief in this shift, though it rarely feels empowering from within, because relief is often mistaken for passivity when it is actually the result of reduced internal conflict. Light does not protect in the way darkness does, because it does not absorb tension or obscure irregularities, but it offers something different, which is a reduction in friction between inner experience and outward presence. When that friction decreases, energy that was once used to maintain boundaries becomes available for movement, awareness, and adaptation, allowing the individual to navigate the world with less resistance. At this level, the contrast between light and dark becomes less about clothing and more about psychological posture. where darkness prioritizes distance and light allows proximity, neither as a permanent state, but as a response shaped by capacity, history, and context. When someone begins to move toward light, it often reflects a moment in which distance feels less necessary, inner weight feels more manageable, and visibility, while still imperfect and unpredictable, no longer feels as threatening as it once did, revealing itself quietly through fabric, reflection, and the way a body occupies space with slightly less restraint than before. While the contrast between light and dark often appears to be a matter of exposure, its deeper psychological function lies in how each regulates internal pressure. Because long before clothing communicates meaning outward, it responds inward to the state of the nervous system that inhabits it. Every individual carries a fluctuating threshold for stimulation, visibility, and social contact. And this threshold is not fixed by personality, but shaped continuously by stress, memory, emotional load, and the amount of unresolved tension currently held within the body. Dark clothing supports lower stimulation by absorbing visual energy and minimizing perceptual demand, which allows the mind to remain contained and inwardly organized when external conditions feel overwhelming or unpredictable. Light clothing, by contrast, increases perceptual exchange, not because it adds stimulation intentionally, but because it reduces the filtering effect that darkness provides, allowing the environment to register the body more clearly, and allowing the body, in turn, to feel more permeable to the world around it. This permeability is psychologically significant because permeability determines how much external information is allowed to pass through the boundary between self and environment without triggering defense. When the nervous system is overloaded, permeability feels dangerous because too much information threatens to destabilize internal equilibrium, which is why periods of stress, grief, or uncertainty often coincide with a retreat into darker tones, heavier fabrics, and more enclosing silhouettes. In these moments, darkness functions as compression, holding the self together when expansion would feel fragmenting rather than freeing. However, as internal pressure begins to shift, not necessarily resolving, but redistributing, the need for compression gradually weakens, creating space for a different relationship with visibility. Light clothing often appears at this point not as a declaration of change, but as a byproduct of reduced internal congestion, where the self no longer requires constant reinforcement to maintain coherence. This transition is subtle and easily misunderstood because it does not always correspond with improved mood, increased confidence, or greater certainty, but rather with a quieter recalibration in how much effort is required simply to exist in relation to others. Psychologically, effort is the key distinction here, because darkness often compensates for internal strain by limiting interaction, while light reduces the need for compensation by allowing interaction to occur with less resistance. When a person wears light clothing during a period of ongoing uncertainty, it does not mean they feel resolved, but that they are no longer using concealment as their primary stabilizing mechanism. This shift often coincides with a growing tolerance for ambiguity, both in how one is perceived and in how one perceives oneself. Because ambiguity becomes less threatening when the self is no longer tightly defended. In this state, misinterpretation still occurs, judgment still exists, and vulnerability remains present. But these experiences no longer destabilize the internal system to the same degree, allowing the person to remain present without retreating immediately into protective distance. Light clothing, in this sense, supports continuity rather than interruption, enabling the individual to stay engaged with their environment even when that environment is imperfect or unpredictable. There is also an important temporal dimension to this process. Because movement toward light is often temporary, context-dependent, and reversible, reflecting current capacity rather than permanent transformation. People frequently return to darker tones during periods of transition, exhaustion, or emotional overload, not because they have regressed, but because the nervous system requires renewed containment to process new information or stress. Light and dark, therefore, do not represent opposing identities, but alternating strategies, each appropriate under different internal conditions. What changes over time is not the elimination of darkness, but the flexibility to move between states without becoming fixed in one mode of regulation. This flexibility is psychologically meaningful because rigidity in appearance often mirrors rigidity in internal coping, whereas adaptability in appearance reflects an increased capacity to respond rather than react. Light clothing becomes possible when responsiveness replaces vigilance. When the individual no longer needs to anticipate every potential interpretation in order to feel stable. This does not require trust in others, but a growing trust in one's ability to absorb experience without disintegrating under its weight. As this trust develops, the boundary between inner and outer becomes less brittle, allowing perception, interaction, and presence to flow more freely across it. The body responds to this shift before the mind articulates it, adjusting posture, movement, and spatial engagement in ways that often go unnoticed by the individual themselves. Light fabrics move differently, reflect differently, and interact with space differently, reinforcing this sense of permeability and reinforcing the psychological state that made it possible in the first place. Over time, this reciprocal relationship between internal regulation and external appearance creates a feedback loop where reduced defense supports greater ease, and greater ease supports reduced defense. This loop does not eliminate discomfort, but it changes how discomfort is held, allowing it to pass through rather than accumulate. In social contexts, this shift can subtly alter how others respond, not because light clothing changes identity, but because reduced internal resistance often manifests as smoother interaction, softer presence, and fewer defensive signals. These changes are rarely conscious and almost never strategic, but they shape relational dynamics nonetheless, reinforcing the individual's sense that visibility no longer carries the same psychological cost it once did. Light, at this stage, becomes less about being seen and more about not needing to hide, a distinction that carries profound implications for how a person moves through shared space. This does not mean openness without boundaries, but boundaries that no longer require constant reinforcement through concealment. The self remains intact, but less compressed, more adaptive and more tolerant of the inevitable friction that accompanies contact with the world. In this way, light clothing reflects a shift from preservation to participation, not as an obligation, but as a capacity that emerges when internal weight becomes more evenly distributed. The individual does not become lighter as a person, but lighter in how much effort it takes to remain present, allowing appearance to follow function rather than dictate it. And so, What appears externally as a simple preference for lighter tones often traces back to a deeper internal movement, where the need for constant containment has softened, and where proximity, while still imperfect and unpredictable, has become manageable enough to allow the self to remain visible without retreat. Beyond regulation and visibility, light and dark also shape how a person relates to time. Because clothing does not only influence how one is seen in the present moment, but how one anticipates the future and carries the past forward into perception. Dark clothing often compresses time, pulling attention inward and anchoring the self to immediate control, where the focus narrows to maintaining stability rather than exploring possibility, which can feel grounding when the future feels uncertain or demanding. Light clothing, by contrast, subtly expands temporal awareness, allowing the mind to drift beyond immediate containment and into a broader sense of continuity, where the present moment feels less like a point of defense and more like part of an ongoing flow. This expansion does not mean optimism or expectation, but a reduced urgency to brace against what comes next, because the nervous system is no longer operating under the assumption that the future requires constant preparation. Psychologically, this shift matters because anticipation consumes energy, and when anticipation relaxes, mental resources are freed to engage with experience rather than resist it. People who wear light clothing often report feeling less rushed internally, even when external demands remain unchanged, because light reflects a state where time feels less compressed and less adversarial. This does not occur because circumstances improve, but because the internal stance toward uncertainty softens, allowing the individual to remain present without constantly projecting threat forward. Darkness supports vigilance, keeping attention tethered to immediate boundaries, while light supports continuity, allowing awareness to stretch without fracturing under the weight of anticipation. In this way, clothing becomes a temporal signal, reinforcing whether the mind is oriented toward defense or toward sustained presence. Light clothing often emerges during periods when a person is no longer trying to outrun their own future or protect themselves from imagined outcomes, but is instead learning to tolerate not knowing what comes next without retreating inward. This tolerance is not passive, nor is it careless, but reflects a recalibration of effort, where the mind no longer treats uncertainty as a constant emergency requiring full containment. As this recalibration takes place, the body responds by loosening posture, adjusting movement, and allowing space between actions, changes that are mirrored and reinforced by lighter tones and fabrics. The visual openness of light clothing aligns with this internal openness to temporal flow, creating coherence between how time is felt internally and how presence is expressed externally. Dark clothing, when worn during periods of temporal stress, helps anchor the self by reducing perceptual demand, which is adaptive and often necessary. But when worn continuously, it can unintentionally reinforce a sense that time must always be managed rather than experienced. Light clothing interrupts this pattern, not by eliminating structure, but by reducing the sense that every moment requires protection or preparation. This interruption allows the individual to experience time as layered rather than compressed, where past, present, and future coexist without overwhelming one another. Psychologically, this layered experience supports reflection without rumination and anticipation without anxiety. because no single temporal dimension dominates the mental field. People often move toward light clothing after prolonged periods of holding themselves together under pressure, when the effort of staying vigilant across time becomes unsustainable and begins to erode internal balance. In these moments, light does not promise ease, but it signals a willingness to let time unfold without constant interference. This willingness often coincides with changes in how memory is carried, because darkness tends to preserve emotional residue by keeping experiences contained, while light allows memory to circulate, integrate, and lose some of its immediacy. As memory becomes less intrusive, the present moment gains space, and with that space comes a reduced need to shield oneself from temporal overlap. Light clothing reflects this shift by allowing the body to exist in the present without being weighed down by unresolved anticipation or lingering past tension. This does not mean the past disappears or the future becomes benign, but that their influence becomes less absolute, allowing the self to remain anchored without becoming rigid. The relationship between clothing and time is rarely conscious, yet it shapes behavior in subtle ways, influencing pace, attention, and responsiveness without drawing focus to itself. Light clothing supports a slower internal tempo, not in movement, but in psychological pacing, where reactions are less immediate and less defensive. This pacing allows interaction to unfold without urgency, creating space for nuance, ambiguity, and adjustment, rather than forcing resolution. As this internal tempo stabilizes, the individual may find that light no longer feels exposing, but simply appropriate, aligning with a sense that time no longer demands constant containment. In this way, light clothing becomes associated with endurance rather than escape, reflecting a state where the self can remain visible across time without needing to withdraw at the first sign of uncertainty. The person does not become indifferent to the future, but less dominated by it, allowing presence to extend beyond immediate defense and into sustained engagement. This engagement does not require clarity or certainty, but it does require tolerance. And tolerance grows when the mind no longer treats time itself as a threat. Light, in this sense, does not symbolize hope, but continuity, allowing the individual to remain present within unfolding experience without compressing themselves to endure it. And as continuity replaces compression, the external choice of lighter clothing quietly mirrors an internal state where time, visibility, and presence coexist with less friction than before. Beyond time and regulation, the contrast between light and dark also reshapes how a person relates to identity, not in the sense of labels or self-concepts, but in the quieter, more fragile way. Identity is felt as something that must either be defended or allowed to remain fluid. Dark clothing often supports a fixed sense of self, because concealment stabilizes identity by reducing contradiction, minimizing exposure to conflicting interpretations, and preserving a coherent outline that can be maintained with relatively little negotiation. When the self feels threatened by change, uncertainty, or internal fragmentation, darkness helps hold identity together by narrowing the range of feedback received from the world, allowing the individual to remain consistent even when that consistency is achieved through restriction. Light clothing disrupts this process by increasing the flow of feedback, not through confrontation, but through openness, making it harder to maintain a rigid self-image without encountering variation, ambiguity, and reinterpretation. Psychologically, this can feel unsettling because identity is often stabilized not by truth, but by repetition, and light introduces too much variability for repetition to remain unquestioned. To be visible is to be seen differently by different people, and to be seen differently is to experience identity as something that shifts across contexts rather than remaining fixed, which challenges the illusion of control that darkness quietly supports. For individuals who rely on stable self-definitions to maintain equilibrium, light clothing can feel destabilizing, not because it reveals something negative, but because it reveals multiplicity, allowing the self to appear inconsistent, incomplete, or unresolved. However, when a person begins to tolerate this multiplicity, light clothing becomes less threatening and more congruent, because it aligns with an internal acceptance that identity does not need to be singular, polished, or fully understood in order to remain intact. This acceptance rarely arrives through insight alone, but through lived experience, where repeated attempts to maintain a fixed identity prove more exhausting than adaptive, leading the individual to loosen their grip rather than tighten it further. Light clothing often appears at this stage, not as a statement of self-expression, but as a reduction in the effort required to protect a particular version of the self from being challenged. In this context, light does not symbolize authenticity in a performative sense, but flexibility, allowing the self to shift slightly without being perceived as fractured or unstable. Darkness protects identity by limiting interpretation, while light exposes identity to reinterpretation. And this exposure becomes tolerable only when reinterpretation no longer feels like erasure. As identity becomes more fluid internally, the need to anchor it externally through concealment diminishes, allowing appearance to reflect adaptability rather than defense. This shift does not eliminate discomfort, because fluid identity still encounters misunderstanding, projection, and judgment, but it reduces the internal stakes attached to these encounters, allowing them to pass without requiring immediate correction or withdrawal. Light clothing supports this reduced reactivity by removing the visual cues that signal resistance or withdrawal, making interaction feel less adversarial even when differences remain. The body responds to this shift by occupying space with less rigidity, moving with slightly more variation, and tolerating minor disruptions without reverting to defensive posture. Changes that reinforce the internal sense that identity can remain intact without constant reinforcement. Over time, this feedback loop strengthens as reduced defense supports adaptability, and adaptability reduces the perceived need for defense, allowing the self to remain visible without feeling compromised. Dark clothing, in contrast, remains valuable during periods when identity feels fragile or under construction, because containment provides the stability needed to rebuild coherence without external interference. Light and dark, therefore, function as identity regulators rather than identity statements, supporting different phases of psychological development depending on internal capacity. What shifts over time is not the elimination of darkness, but the ability to move between concealment and visibility without attaching existential weight to either state. Light clothing becomes possible when identity is no longer treated as something that must be proven, protected, or perfected, but as something that can remain open-ended without collapsing under scrutiny. This openness does not require certainty, but it does require resilience, the kind that comes from surviving contradiction without retreating entirely into concealment. As resilience increases, the individual may find that light clothing feels less like exposure and more like alignment, reflecting an internal state where identity is held lightly rather than tightly. In this way, appearance ceases to function as armor and begins to function as surface, not revealing everything, but no longer tasked with hiding what feels unresolved. The self remains complex, layered, and imperfect, but it no longer depends on darkness to preserve coherence, allowing light to enter not as a challenge, but as a condition that identity can now withstand. When this threshold is crossed, light clothing no longer feels risky, because the self no longer requires constant defense to remain whole, allowing visibility to coexist with continuity rather than threaten it. Beyond regulation, time, and identity, the contrast between light and dark also shapes how a person relates to emotional weight, because clothing quietly mirrors how much feeling the inner system is currently able to carry without becoming overloaded or rigid. Emotional weight does not always announce itself through intensity or expression, but often through accumulation, through small unresolved tensions that gather beneath awareness and slowly increase the effort required to remain composed, attentive, and functional. Dark clothing tends to support the management of this accumulation by compressing emotional experience inward, reducing outward permeability, and limiting the number of channels through which feeling can be triggered, amplified, or exposed. This compression is not avoidance in a simple sense, but a form of containment that allows emotion to remain present without overflowing, which is why darkness often feels stabilizing during periods of grief, responsibility, disappointment, or prolonged pressure. When emotional weight is high, visibility can feel dangerous because being seen increases the likelihood that inner strain will be reflected back through interaction, misunderstanding, or unintentional exposure. Darkness protects against this reflection by absorbing not only light, but emotional signal, allowing the individual to move through space without inviting response to states they may not yet be able to articulate or regulate. Light clothing alters this balance by increasing emotional permeability, not because it forces expression, but because it reduces the barriers that normally contain feeling within the body. When the body becomes more visible, emotion often feels closer to the surface, not in intensity, but in accessibility, making it harder to ignore, suppress, or indefinitely postpone internal processing. For someone carrying unresolved emotional weight, this accessibility can feel destabilizing, as if light removes the margin of safety that once allowed emotion to remain backgrounded rather than foregrounded. However, when emotional weight begins to redistribute rather than accumulate, the need for compression gradually diminishes, creating space for a different relationship with feeling. Light clothing often appears at this point, not because the emotional burden has disappeared, but because it has become more evenly distributed across awareness rather than concentrated in defensive tension. This redistribution allows emotion to move rather than stagnate, reducing the pressure that once required constant containment. Psychologically, movement is critical, because emotions that circulate are easier to integrate than emotions that are held rigidly in place. Light clothing supports this circulation by aligning external openness with internal allowance, making it easier for feeling to pass through awareness without becoming overwhelming. This does not mean increased emotional expression or vulnerability in a social sense, but a reduced need to hold feeling apart from presence. People in this state often describe a sense of lightness that has little to do with happiness and much to do with reduced resistance, where emotions arise and pass without demanding immediate control or suppression. Dark clothing, in contrast, becomes necessary again when emotional load increases beyond current capacity, not as a regression, but as a protective recalibration that allows the system to regain balance. Light and dark thus function as emotional load-bearing strategies, each appropriate under different internal conditions. The problem arises not from using darkness, but from becoming fixed in it, where emotional containment turns into emotional stagnation, and feeling remains compressed long after it could have been allowed to move. Light clothing disrupts this stagnation by subtly encouraging engagement with emotional experience, not through confrontation, but through presence, allowing feeling to be acknowledged without being dramatized. This acknowledgement reduces internal friction, because what is allowed to exist no longer requires energy to suppress. As friction decreases, emotional weight becomes easier to carry, not because it is lighter in substance, but because it is no longer resisted at every point of contact. The body reflects this shift through changes in posture, breath, and movement, all of which influence how clothing is experienced and chosen. Light fabrics often feel more tolerable when the body is less armored, when muscles are not constantly braced against internal pressure, and when breath is allowed to move without restriction. These physical sensations reinforce the psychological state that made them possible, creating a feedback loop where reduced emotional resistance supports openness, and openness further reduces resistance. In social contexts, this shift can subtly alter interaction, as reduced internal tension often manifests as calmer presence, fewer defensive cues, and a greater tolerance for emotional ambiguity. Others may respond differently, not because light clothing changes personality, but because the absence of emotional shielding changes the relational field. This does not guarantee safety or understanding, but it reduces the internal cost of remaining present when emotional complexity arises. Light clothing, at this stage, becomes less about exposure and more about accommodation, allowing the self to exist alongside emotional weight, rather than constantly bracing against it. The individual does not become emotionally unburdened, but emotionally mobile, capable of carrying feeling without being defined or constrained by it. In this way, the choice of lighter tones reflects a deeper internal adjustment, where emotional weight is no longer treated as something that must be hidden or compressed, but as something that can be held within visibility without overwhelming the system that carries it. When this threshold is reached, light no longer feels risky, because emotion itself has become less rigid, allowing presence to expand without collapsing under the weight it once struggled to contain. Beyond emotional weight, the movement between dark and light also reshapes how a person experiences social power, not in the obvious sense of dominance or submission, but in the quieter dynamics of influence, resistance, and psychological positioning within shared space. Dark clothing has long been associated with authority, seriousness, and control, because it reduces visual noise, sharpens boundaries, and allows the wearer to occupy space with minimal invitation, signaling distance rather than approachability without requiring explicit assertion. This distance can feel empowering when a person needs to preserve autonomy, maintain leverage, or avoid being drawn into interactions that demand emotional labor or explanation. Light clothing alters this dynamic by softening boundaries and increasing approachability, not because it weakens the individual, but because it reduces the signals that enforce separation between self and others. Psychologically, this shift matters because power is not only about influence over others, but about the capacity to remain present without resorting to withdrawal or control. When someone feels internally stable, they often no longer require the visual markers that communicate resistance or authority, allowing light clothing to feel congruent rather than compromising. Light does not erase power, but it redistributes it, shifting influence from control toward presence, from intimidation toward accessibility. This redistribution can feel risky for those who have learned to rely on distance as their primary means of maintaining psychological safety, because approachability increases the likelihood of engagement, interpretation, and demand. However, when internal boundaries are secure, engagement no longer threatens autonomy, allowing the individual to remain open without feeling overextended. In this state, light clothing reflects confidence that does not need reinforcement through visual dominance, because power is no longer sourced from how others are managed, but from how the self is regulated. Dark clothing becomes unnecessary as a signal of seriousness or strength, because seriousness is no longer mistaken for rigidity, and strength is no longer confused with concealment. This does not mean the individual becomes passive or accommodating, but that resistance no longer needs to be broadcast in advance. Light clothing allows interaction to unfold without preemptive defense, trusting that boundaries can be asserted if needed, rather than enforced through appearance. This trust often emerges after repeated experiences where distance failed to produce safety, and where engagement, while imperfect, proved manageable. As a result, the individual may discover that influence can be exercised through responsiveness rather than withdrawal, through presence rather than opacity. Light clothing supports this discovery by removing the visual cues that signal unavailability, allowing social dynamics to develop with greater fluidity. In professional or public contexts, this can subtly shift how others respond, not by diminishing respect, but by changing the tone of interaction from guarded to reciprocal. Reciprocity does not eliminate hierarchy or disagreement, but it reduces unnecessary tension, allowing power to circulate rather than remain fixed. Dark clothing remains valuable in situations where boundaries must be reinforced quickly, or where psychological distance is necessary to maintain focus or authority. Light clothing becomes viable when those boundaries are internalized, allowing the individual to rely less on external signals to manage interaction. This internalization marks a shift from defensive power to relational power, where influence arises from the capacity to remain engaged without losing coherence. Light does not make the individual less formidable, but less reactive, allowing responses to be chosen rather than triggered. As reactivity decreases, the need to control the social field through appearance diminishes, making openness feel less like vulnerability and more like option. In this way, light clothing reflects a recalibration of power, where strength is measured not by how effectively one can withdraw, but by how steadily one can remain present within shared space. The individual retains the ability to retreat into darkness when necessary, but no longer depends on it to maintain authority or self-respect. This flexibility allows appearance to serve context rather than defense, aligning outward signals with internal capacity rather than habitual protection. When light clothing no longer threatens power, it becomes an expression of ease rather than exposure, signaling that the self can engage without being diminished by proximity. The person does not surrender influence, but redistributes it inward, allowing power to emerge through regulation, clarity, and the quiet confidence of not needing to be guarded at all times. At the deepest level, the movement between dark and light reflects how a person relates to existence itself, not philosophically, but experientially, through the ongoing negotiation between holding on and allowing things to pass without resistance. Dark clothing often supports a mode of being that emphasizes preservation, where energy is conserved, exposure is minimized, and life is approached as something that must be managed carefully in order to avoid unnecessary loss, disruption, or depletion. This mode is not pessimistic, but protective, shaped by experiences where openness carried consequences that were difficult to integrate at the time, teaching the individual that restraint was safer than expansion. Light clothing signals a subtle shift away from this stance, not because danger has disappeared, but because the effort required to constantly preserve has become heavier than the risk of allowing experience to move through without interception. Psychologically, this marks a change in how impermanence is tolerated, because light aligns with a willingness to let moments arise, register, and dissolve without attempting to secure them against change. Darkness seeks continuity through control, while light allows continuity through flow. And this distinction becomes meaningful only when the individual is no longer trying to extract certainty from every encounter. To exist in light is not to deny loss, unpredictability, or misunderstanding, but to accept that resisting these realities consumes more energy than accommodating them. This acceptance does not arrive through insight alone, but through lived saturation, where repeated attempts to control outcomes fail to produce lasting stability, gradually teaching the system that flexibility may be less costly than rigidity. Light clothing often appears after such saturation, when the individual no longer feels compelled to brace against every interaction or prepare for every possible interpretation. In this state, presence becomes less conditional, allowing the self to remain available to experience without demanding guarantees in return. Visibility no longer feels like exposure, because exposure implies threat. And threat loses intensity when the individual trusts their capacity to absorb experience without disintegrating. This trust is quiet and uncelebrated, grounded not in optimism, but in endurance, in the knowledge that one can remain intact even when things unfold imperfectly. Light reflects this endurance by allowing the body to remain open to the world without collapsing inward or retreating into concealment. There is a noticeable easing in how life is approached at this stage, not as passivity, but as reduced resistance, where effort is reserved for what genuinely requires it, rather than expended on constant self-protection. Darkness remains available, no longer as default, but as option, something the individual can return to when circumstances demand containment rather than flow. This choice marks a fundamental shift, because what was once necessary becomes contextual, and what was once habitual becomes flexible. Light clothing, in this sense, does not symbolize transformation or arrival, but but adaptability, the capacity to move with life rather than brace against it. The individual does not become transparent or unguarded, but selectively open, able to adjust proximity without losing coherence. This selective openness allows experience to deepen without overwhelming, creating a sense of continuity that does not rely on control. Over time, this way of relating to existence reduces internal conflict because the self no longer fights the conditions of being seen, changing, or misunderstood. Energy once spent on defense becomes available for attention, curiosity, and sustained engagement with the present moment. Light clothing mirrors this redistribution by removing unnecessary barriers between inner state and outward presence. The world does not become safer, clearer, or more predictable, but the individual becomes more capable of remaining present within it. In this capacity, appearance no longer serves as armor or signal, but as accommodation, adjusting naturally to internal conditions rather than enforcing external control. Light ceases to be symbolic and becomes practical, aligning with a state where life is no longer treated as something to survive moment by moment, but as something that can be inhabited without constant resistance. This does not eliminate darkness, but it contextualizes it, allowing concealment and openness to coexist without conflict. And in that coexistence, the self finds a quieter equilibrium, where visibility, uncertainty, and continuity are no longer experienced as opposing forces, but as interwoven conditions of simply being present, allowing light to reflect what no longer needs to be held back.